Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey, not to a serene ancient temple or a bustling imperial city, but to a place where human will clash with unforgiving nature on an epic, brutal scale. Imagine this: you're standing on a desolate, windswept ridge, the sun beating down mercilessly, or perhaps the biting wind whipping snow into your face. Before you stretches an endless line of raw earth and rough stone, winding its way over mountains and through valleys, disappearing into the hazy distance. This isn't a scenic wonder, it's a colossal monument to human suffering, built brick by agonizing brick, under conditions that would make your toughest workout feel like a spa day. You probably won't survive this, but we're going to uncover the awful truth about building the Great Wall of China. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back in time, perhaps during the Qin dynasty, when the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, began consolidating and connecting earlier defensive walls into a massive, unified barrier. Or perhaps you're in the Ming dynasty, centuries later, when much of the iconic brick and stone wall we see today was constructed. Whatever the era, the air is thick with dust, the distant thud of hammers, and the groan of straining bodies. The romantic image of a majestic dragon snaking across the landscape quickly dissipates, replaced by a brutal reality of forced labor and unimaginable hardship. The Great Wall isn't a single continuous structure built all at once. It's a vast network of walls, trenches, watchtowers, and fortresses, built and rebuilt over centuries by various dynasties, primarily to protect China's northern frontiers from invading nomadic tribes like the Xiongnu. But the constant that spans these centuries of construction is the immense human cost. This wasn't a voluntary public works project. It was an imperial mandate, driven by an iron will and enforced with ruthless efficiency. One mainstream historical fact that immediately shatters the popular myth of peaceful construction is that the Great Wall was built primarily through forced labor, conscripting vast numbers of soldiers, peasants, convicts, and even scholars who were compelled to work under extremely harsh conditions, often far from their homes, leading to widespread suffering and immense mortality rates. It was a system built on coercion, not cheerful cooperation. Think about that: millions of people if forced into backbreaking labor with no choice, no escape. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the desperation and fatalism of the era is the folktale of Meng Jiangnu, whose tears caused a section of the wall to collapse, revealing the bones of her husband, a conscripted worker. This poignant legend, passed down through generations, underscores the deep human tragedy and personal loss associated with the wall's construction, even if the wall itself never actually wept for its victims. Imagine a monument so steeped in sorrow that it literally evokes weeping walls. Historians still argue whether the staggering death tolls attributed to wall construction were primarily due to direct physical hardship and accidents, or if disease, starvation, and the brutality of overseers were the more significant. Silent killers. Was it the work itself, or the conditions surrounding it, that claimed the most lives? You feel the dry, dusty air in your lungs, the relentless sun beating down on your neck, or the numbing cold seeping into your bones. The landscape is vast, unforgiving, ranging from arid deserts to craggy mountain ranges, each presenting its own unique set of environmental challenges. Yet the wall must go on, pushing through every obstacle, driven by the imperial decree. You see thousands of figures, tiny against the immense scale of the project, toiling endlessly, their lives reduced to the movement of earth and stone. And as you gaze upon this awe-inspiring yet terrible structure, you begin to grasp the awful truth: this isn't just a wall, it's a colossal monument built on the sweat, blood, and broken lives of millions. The moment you arrive at a wall construction site, the first and most overwhelming reality that confronts you is the sheer scale of the human effort, fueled by forced labor millions toil. This wasn't a voluntary workforce seeking employment. It was a vast, unwilling army of conscripts, dragged from their homes and livelihoods across the vast Chinese empire, compelled by imperial decree to endure unimaginable hardship. You are now one of them, a cog in an immense, relentless machine, stripped of your autonomy and forced to contribute to a monumental task that will likely consume your very life. It's like being forced into a colossal, never-ending chain gang, where escape is impossible and the work is literally backbreaking. You see them everywhere, farmers ripped from their fields, their hands accustomed to plows now gripping crude tools for quarrying, soldiers, no longer fighting on battlefields, but building defenses and convicts, their crimes perhaps minor, now serving out sentences of unimaginable severity. Even scholars and intellectuals, deemed troublesome by the emperors, were sometimes conscripted, their minds now reduced to moving rock. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the brutal recruitment practices is that the building of the Great Wall relied heavily on mass conscription, forcing millions of peasants, soldiers, and convicts into brutal labor service, often for years at a time, under conditions of extreme duress and with little hope of return. This vast human resource was the engine of the wall's construction. Imagine the forced march to the construction site. You've traveled hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles from your home village, shackled or closely guarded, often with little food or water. Many would die even before reaching the wall, collapsing from exhaustion, disease, or starvation along the arduous journey. A particularly quirky tidbit that illustrates the desperate lengths people would go to avoid this fate is the widespread practice of self-mutilation, or even faking illness, hoping to be deemed unfit for service. Imagine deliberately breaking your own leg, or drinking poison to induce a fever, just to escape a summons to the wall. Historians still argue whether the scale of forced labor on the Great Wall truly reached millions concurrently, or if this figure represents the cumulative total over centuries of construction and reconstruction, with smaller, though still massive, workforces present at any given time. Was it an instantaneous legion of suffering, or a long, drawn-out agony over generations? Once at the site, your life becomes a brutal monotony of endless physical labor. You are assigned to a work gang, perhaps digging trenches, breaking rocks, or hauling materials. The tasks are relentless, from dawn till dusk, 7 days a week. There's no concept of weekends, no rest days, only the continuous demand for progress. Supervisors, often cruel and unfeeling, drive the workers with whips and threats, tolerating no idleness or dissent. Your diet is meager, often just a handful of coarse grain, barely enough to sustain your strength for the arduous tasks. Water is scarce and often contaminated. Shelter is crude, temporary barracks, offering little protection from the elements. You sleep in cramped conditions, surrounded by the groans of exhausted men, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the constant threat of disease. Forced labor on the wall was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. You are constantly reminded of your lack of freedom, your complete subjugation to imperial will, the knowledge that you are far from home, with little chance of ever seeing your family again, weighs heavily on your spirit. Escape is almost impossible. The vastness of the empire, the harshness of the surrounding lands, and the relentless pursuit of overseers make any attempt a near-certain death sentence. You see the despair in the eyes of your fellow conscripts, the silent endurance born of utter helplessness. Some work until they collapse, never to rise again. Others simply fade away, succumbing to illness or the sheer grind of the labor. You are merely one body among millions, a disposable resource in the Emperor's grand design. The sound of picks striking rock, the rhythmic grunts of men hauling heavy loads, the distant shouts of overseers, these become the relentless soundtrack to your existence. The beautiful, sweeping curves of the wall, From a distance, Vidas seem magnificent, but up close, they are stained with the sweat, tears, and blood of countless forced laborers, a brutal reality that utterly shatters any romantic image. You are building one of the world's greatest wonders, but you are doing so under duress, a testament to the chilling power of an empire that could command millions to toil and perish for its ambition. As you labor under the relentless imperial mandate, the very environment around you transforms into another formidable enemy, the harsh climate elements as enemies. The vast expanse that the Great Wall traverses isn't a temperate, easily managed landscape. It cuts through some of China's most extreme and unforgiving terrains, exposing the millions of conscripted workers to a brutal gauntlet of natural forces that often proved as lethal as any invading army. You quickly learn that survival isn't just about moving stones. It's about enduring the relentless, life-sapping assault of sun, wind, dust, and ice. It's like being forced to build a monumental structure while constantly fighting against the planet itself, where every gust of wind feels like a personal attack. You might find yourself in the sweltering heat of summer, working in the arid, dusty regions of the northern plains or the edges of the Gobi Desert. The sun beats down with a merciless intensity, baking the ground and radiating heat. The air shimmers, and the only sounds are the rasp of your breath, the incessant buzz of flies, and the distant, agonizing groan of a fellow worker collapsing from heat stroke. Dehydration is a constant threat, as fresh water is scarce and often carried over vast distances. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this environmental brutality is that workers on the Great Wall faced extreme climatic conditions, including scorching desert heat in summer, biting sub-zero temperatures and blizzards in winter, and relentless winds that scoured the mountainous and desolate frontier regions, leading to widespread suffering and death from exposure. The wall's path deliberately chose challenging, exposed terrain for defensive advantage. Imagine the dust. It's everywhere. It whips into your eyes, grinds between your teeth, and coats your skin in a fine, gritty layer, turning sweat into mud. Dust storms can descend without warning, reducing visibility to zero, choking lungs, and burying equipment. These aren't just inconvenient, they are debilitating, making every breath a struggle and every task harder. Then comes the winter. The very thought sends a chill through your bones. The northern frontiers experience brutally cold winters, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing and fierce blizzards sweeping across the exposed mountains and plains. Your flimsy clothing and crude shelters offer little protection. Frostbite becomes a common companion, gnawing at fingers and toes, sometimes leading to gangrene and amputation without those trusty pirate surgeons. Remember, you see men huddling together for warmth, their bodies shivering uncontrollably, their faces blue with cold. Sleep is a constant battle against the numbing chill, and waking up with frost-nipped extremities is a daily fear. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the desperation against the elements is the reported use of camel dung as fuel for fires in some desolate, treeless sections of the wall. Imagine trying to stay warm using dried animal waste, its acrid smoke filling your makeshift shelter, all just to survive another night. Historians still argue whether the primary cause of worker mortality on the wall was the direct physical labor and accidents, or if the unrelenting exposure to these extreme and rapidly changing climatic conditions, combined with poor nutrition and inadequate shelter, was the more significant silent killer, slowly weakening bodies until they succumbed to illness or exposure. Was it the work, or the weather, that truly took the highest toll? The wind is a constant, insidious enemy. It howls through the passes, whipping sand and snow, making it impossible to hear or communicate. It saps your body heat, dehydrates you, and simply adds to the pervasive sense of misery. On exposed ridges, the wind can be so strong it makes simply standing upright a challenge, let alone carrying heavy stones. The mountains themselves present a further challenge. Building on steep slopes means constant uphill climbs, often carrying heavy loads. The thin air at high altitudes makes breathing difficult, especially during strenuous labor. Rockfalls and avalanches are ever-present dangers in certain seasons. You feel the sun burning your skin, then the biting wind chilling you to the bone, followed by the insidious itch of dust. The elements are not just a backdrop to your labor, they are active, relentless tormentors, constantly testing the limits of human endurance. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that you weren't just battling the earth and stone, you were battling the very forces of nature, a battle that countless conscripts lost, their bodies simply consumed by the unforgiving elements, becoming an unrecorded part of the wall's grim, enduring legacy, as if the brutal climate wasn't enough. The very land itself conspired against the builders of the Great Wall, presenting an impossible terrain nature's obstacles that demanded superhuman effort to overcome. This wasn't building on flat, cleared ground. It was about forcing a colossal structure to snake its way over sheer mountain peaks, through treacherous valleys, across roaring rivers, and through vast, desolate deserts. Every meter of progress was an agonizing victory against the raw, unyielding power of the natural world. It's like trying to draw a perfectly straight line with a shaky hand across a crumpled, jagged piece of paper, where every crease and tear presents a new, exhausting challenge. You gaze up at a towering cliff face, almost vertical, and then look at the plans etched into the dirt by an overseer the wall is meant to go up that. The thought alone makes your muscles ache. Hauling massive stones or compacted earth up such an incline, with only primitive tools and brute force, seems utterly insurmountable. Yet, the imperial decree is absolute. The wall must follow the most strategic defensive lines, regardless of the geological nightmares they present. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this immense engineering challenge is that the Great Wall was intentionally constructed along challenging and naturally defensive geographical features, including steep mountain ridges, deep valleys, and arid deserts, requiring immense engineering ingenuity and backbreaking labor to overcome seemingly impossible terrain. The natural landscape dictated the wall's brutal path. Imagine trying to excavate foundations on a narrow, crumbling mountain ridge, where one wrong step could send you plummeting thousands of feet below, or attempting to build a watchtower on a wind-swept peak, constantly battling the elements and the sheer difficulty of transporting materials uphill. The sheer elevation changes were exhausting, forcing workers to constantly climb and descend, carrying heavy loads. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the ingenuity and desperation in facing this terrain is the use of natural features as part of the wall itself. Instead of building entirely new structures, some sections incorporated existing cliffs or natural rock formations into the defensive line, effectively letting nature do some of the building for them. Imagine running out of stones and just deciding to paint the side of a mountain and call it part of the wall. Historians still argue whether the strategic advantage gained by building on such difficult terrain, making it harder for invaders, was ultimately worth the staggering human cost and engineering challenge, or if a simpler, less arduous route might have offered comparable defense with less expenditure of life and resources. Was it a stroke of genius, or an act of costly hubris? Then there are the rivers. The wall had to cross countless waterways, from meandering streams to wide, fast-flowing rivers. This required the construction of bridges, often rudimentary stone or timber affairs, or the laborious process of diverting watercourses. Building foundations in riverbeds was treacherous, with currents, floods, and shifting sands posing constant threats to both structures and workers. You can almost feel the cold, swift current tugging at your legs as you attempt to lay stones in a rushing river. And the deserts? Vast, desolate stretches where building materials are scarce. Water is non-existent, and the terrain is shifting sand dunes or hard, cracked earth. Transporting building materials across these empty expanses was an epic undertaking, often requiring long, slow marches, further contributing to the logistical nightmare. The wind, remember that it exacerbates the desert's hostility, constantly eroding progress. The sheer scale of the geographical obstacles meant that different sections of the wall were built, using vastly different techniques and materials. Adapting to the local environment, on mountains, it might be stone. In the plains, compacted earth. In the deserts, sometimes even reeds or sand. This adaptability, while a testament to human persistence, also meant that no single construction method prevailed, adding to the complexity of the project. You wipe sweat from your brow, or perhaps shiver in the biting wind, as you look at the seemingly endless challenge before you. Every rock you pry from the earth, every bucket of compacted soil you carry, feels like a battle against the very planet itself. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that it wasn't just a project of human labor. It was a defiant, desperate struggle against nature's most formidable obstacles, a relentless confrontation with impossible terrain that consumed lives with every step of its arduous, winding path. As you continue your grueling work on the Great Wall, battling the elements and the impossible terrain, you quickly come to appreciate another brutal reality: primitive tools. Manual misery. Forget the heavy machinery, hydraulic lifts, or even sophisticated scaffolding of modern construction. Here, every task, from quarrying stone to lifting massive timbers, is accomplished through sheer human muscle, aided by the simplest, often crudest implements. You feel the constant ache in your back, the blisters on your hands, and the pervasive exhaustion that comes from relentlessly pushing your body beyond its limits with nothing but a pickaxe, a rope, and the will of an emperor. It's like trying to build a skyscraper with only a hammer and a wheelbarrow. Every tiny step is a monumental effort. You grasp a heavy, iron-tipped pickaxe, its wooden handle rough against your calloused hands. Your task is to break apart rock, to loosen earth, or to hew raw stone into manageable blocks. The work is slow, laborious, and incredibly dangerous. Chips of rock fly, sharp edges threaten, and the constant jarring vibrations travel up your arms, shaking your bones. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the sheer physical toll of this work is that the construction of the Great Wall relied almost entirely on manual labor, with workers using rudimentary tools like hammers, chisels, picks, shovels, ropes, and simple rollers, making every stage of construction, from quarrying to transport, an incredibly arduous and physically demanding process. This lack of advanced technology meant that human bodies were the primary machines. Imagine trying to move a massive stone block, weighing hundreds of pounds with only wooden rollers and thick ropes. Dozens of men would strain and heave, grunting in unison, their muscles bulging as they slowly, painfully, dragged the material across uneven ground. Accidents were frequent: ropes snapping, stones slipping, crushing limbs or lives in an instant. There was no concept of safety regulations, no protective gear beyond your meager clothing. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the ingenuity born of necessity and the lack of better options is the reported use of goats or other small animals to carry lighter loads up steep, inaccessible mountain paths. Imagine a stubborn goat, laden with bricks, slowly picking its way up a treacherous slope, performing a task that would be almost impossible for a human. Historians still argue whether the apparent simplicity of these ancient tools hindered innovation and kept construction methods rudimentary, or if the sheer scale of the workforce and their collective brute strength meant that even primitive tools, when applied by millions, were surprisingly effective at achieving monumental feats of engineering. Did it stifle progress or demonstrate the power of raw labor? Even the process of compacting earth for certain sections of the wall was incredibly labor-intensive. Layers of earth and gravel would be pounded repeatedly with heavy, flat tampers, wielded by groups of men, until the material was dense and hard. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the tampers would become a constant, hypnotic backdrop to your days, a testament to the endless, repetitive nature of the work. Transporting materials was equally grueling. Wood for scaffolding and watchtowers, bricks, stone, earth, all had to be moved over vast distances, often up steep inclines, using human power or simple animal-drawn carts. The lack of roads or established paths in many remote regions meant that every journey was an epic struggle against the terrain. Consuming immense amounts of time and energy, you feel the persistent ache in your muscles, the chafing of the rough tools against your skin, and the ever-present fatigue that sinks into your bones. Your hands are raw, your back is perpetually sore, and your shoulders ache from carrying heavy loads. The slow, arduous pace of construction is dictated by the limitations of these basic implements and the brute force of the human body. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its magnificent scale was achieved not through technological brilliance, but through the immense, back-breaking suffering of millions, whose lives were literally spent moving the earth, one primitive tool and one agonizing step at a time. Every stone, every compacted layer of earth, holds the invisible imprint of manual misery. As you continue your grueling existence building the Great Wall, moving mountains with primitive tools, you quickly realize that the monumental scale of the project presented a challenge far beyond just physical labor. The logistics nightmare supplying the frontier. Imagine trying to feed, clothe, and equip millions of workers spread across thousands of miles of often desolate and hostile terrain, all without modern transportation or communication. The failure to do so, or even minor disruptions, meant starvation, sickness, and further despair for the conscripts. It's like trying to cater a massive rock concert across an entire continent using only bicycles and handcarts. You often go to sleep hungry, your stomach rumbling with a dull ache. The food you receive is coarse and meager, a daily ration of millet or barley, perhaps a few dried vegetables, and, very rarely, a scrap of salted meat. This barely sustains your strength for the brutal work, leaving you perpetually on the edge of exhaustion. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this immense logistical hurdle is that the sheer scale and remote location of Great Wall construction sites created a massive logistical challenge in supplying millions of conscripted workers with adequate food, water, tools, and clothing, leading to widespread famine, malnutrition, and significant mortality due to supply chain failures. The logistics were often as deadly as the work itself. Imagine the incredible effort required to transport these supplies. Grain had to be collected from distant agricultural regions, often hundreds or thousands of miles away, then hauled by ox cart, donkey, or human porter across rivers, mountains, and deserts to the remote construction sites. Tools, made of iron, had to be forged and transported. Clothing, especially essential for the bitter winters, also had to be produced and moved. This was a slow, arduous, and incredibly inefficient process, constantly battling the elements and the vast distances. A particularly quirky tidbit that illustrates the desperate measures taken is the alleged use of human chains for transporting materials up steep mountain slopes where even pack animals couldn't go. Workers would line up, passing individual bricks or stones hand to hand, inching them up the incline. Imagine a line of thousands of sweating, straining bodies stretching up a mountain, slowly, agonizingly moving material one piece at a time. Historians still argue whether the challenges of supplying the wall's vast workforce were primarily due to the sheer logistical complexity in an ancient empire, or if systemic corruption and inefficient administration also played a significant role in diverting or failing to deliver essential provisions, exacerbating the suffering of the workers. Was it purely logistical, or was there human malice involved? The corruption we'll discuss later also played a role here. Supplies intended for the workers might be diverted or skimmed off by corrupt officials along the supply chain, leaving the laborers with even less. This not only caused starvation, but also bred resentment and despair. You might see a cart laden with sacks of grain pass by, knowing that a significant portion of it will never reach the common workers. Instead, lining the pockets of officials. Water, as you already know, was another critical and often scarce resource. In arid regions, it had to be brought from distant wells or oases, often by human carriers, adding another layer of brutal labor to the logistics. Contaminated water, when available, led to rampant disease. The failures of this logistical system were devastating. When supplies ran short, workers starved. When tools broke, work slowed, leading to harsh punishments from overseers. When clothing didn't arrive before winter, workers froze to death. The chain of supply was fragile, easily broken by bad weather, banditry, or simply the sheer inefficiency of moving so much across such immense distances. You feel the gnawing hunger in your stomach, the constant throb of thirst, and the chilling cold that penetrates your thin clothing. These aren't just inconveniences, they are symptoms of a failing logistical system, a system designed to fuel a monumental construction project, but which often left its human components to perish. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its grandeur was built not just on stone and earth, but on the profound suffering caused by an empire's inability to adequately sustain the millions it condemned to brutal, unending labor, turning the very act of supply into another relentless, life-threatening challenge. Even if you somehow endured the back-breaking labor, the extreme climate, the impossible terrain, and the constant hunger from logistical failures, an insidious, invisible enemy stalked every construction site along the Great Wall. Disease and death, unseen killers, far more prolific than any falling stone or overzealous overseer. Sickness swept through the vast legions of conscripted workers with terrifying efficiency, turning the construction sites into vast, unacknowledged graveyards. You quickly learn that your greatest foe isn't the cold, or the heat, or the heavy stones, but the microscopic invaders that thrive in the unsanitary, overcrowded conditions. It's like being in a constant, invisible battle against an enemy that you cannot see, cannot understand, and from which there is no escape. You see it happen to your fellow workers. One day, a man is toiling beside you, strong and seemingly healthy. The next, he is racked with fever, his body convulsing, or perhaps writhing in the throes of agonizing dysentery. There are no doctors in the modern sense, no medicines, no understanding of how these invisible scourges spread. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the human cost of the wall is that disease, including typhus, cholera, dysentery, and various fevers, was the single largest cause of death among Great Wall laborers, compounded by malnutrition, exhaustion, overcrowding in barracks, and profoundly unsanitary conditions, leading to staggering mortality rates. The wall earned its grim nickname, the longest cemetery in the world, for a reason. Imagine the pervasive smell of sickness, the makeshift barracks. Remember those, they are incredibly cramped and offer little ventilation. When one man falls ill, the entire dormitory becomes a breeding ground for contagion. The air is thick with coughs, groans, and the stench of unwashed bodies and unemptied waste. You try to keep your distance, to breathe shallowly, but in such confined spaces, isolation is impossible. A particularly quirky tidbit that illustrates the despair and lack of knowledge regarding disease is the reported practice of some workers trying to escape outbreaks by self-mutilation, hoping to be sent home for being unfit, even at the cost of a limb, or the belief that certain auspicious days or rituals could ward off sickness, leading to frantic, superstitious practices rather than practical hygiene. Imagine desperately cutting off your own finger to avoid a fever that you don't understand, simply because you hope it will buy you a ticket home. Historians still argue whether the Chinese authorities were genuinely ignorant of basic public health measures like isolating the sick or improving sanitation, or if the sheer scale of the workforce and the imperative to build quickly simply made it logistically impossible to implement any effective preventative measures, even if they had a rudimentary understanding of contagion. Was it pure ignorance or insurmountable challenges? Water, as we've discussed, was often scarce and contaminated, leading to rampant outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. These diseases would cause rapid dehydration and agonizing death, sweeping through work gangs like wildfire. Lice, thriving in the unwashed clothing and cramped conditions. Spread typhus, a fever that left victims delirious and often fatal. Every scratch, every minor cut could become infected, leading to gangrene and a slow, agonizing demise. Malnutrition and exhaustion, exacerbated by the harsh climate and brutal labor, weakened the workers' immune systems, making them incredibly susceptible to any infection that passed through the camps. Your body, already pushed to its absolute limits by manual misery and extreme weather, had little left to fight off invisible invaders. The dying were often simply left to perish where they lay, or dragged a short distance from the immediate work area. Burial was often hasty and shallow, sometimes with dozens of bodies thrown into a single pit, further contributing to the spread of disease in the immediate vicinity. There were no compassionate nurses, no clean hospitals, just the grim, unfeeling efficiency of death. You hear the hacking coughs in the night, the distressed cries from a nearby bunk, and you know, with a cold certainty, that the unseen killer is always present, hovering over you, waiting for your moment of weakness. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its stones were cemented not just by mortar, but by the unseen blood, sweat, and bodily fluids of millions who succumbed to disease. The grand structure stands as a testament to imperial power, but for those who built it, their lives were consumed by a brutal, silent war against enemies they could not see and could never hope to defeat. As if the relentless elements, impossible terrain, and invisible diseases weren't enough. The men toiling on the Great Wall faced another, very human. Terror supervision and brutality. Iron Fist, the imperial mandate to build was absolute, and those in charge of its enforcement wielded immense, often unchecked power, ensuring progress through fear, coercion, and extreme physical violence. You quickly learn that failing to meet quotas, questioning authority, or showing any sign of weakness will be met with swift, agonizing retribution, transforming your overseers into tormentors, their iron fist crushing any flicker of resistance. It's like working for the most demanding boss imaginable, where the penalty for underperformance isn't a demotion, but a public beating. You see them constantly patrolling the work sites, the imperial officials, the military officers, and their immediate subordinates. They are often mounted on horseback, their silken robes or armor a stark contrast to your own ragged clothing. Their faces are stern, their eyes sharp, constantly scanning the endless lines of laborers for any sign of slackening. They carry whips, heavy sticks, or sometimes even swords, symbols of their absolute authority and their willingness to use it. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this harsh management is that the construction of the Great Wall was overseen by a brutal system of imperial and military officials who employed extreme coercion, frequent corporal punishment, including flogging and mutilation, and even summary executions to maintain discipline, enforce quotas, and prevent desertion among the conscripted workforce. The human cost was simply a price to be paid for imperial ambition. Imagine the constant tension in the air. Every swing of your pickaxe, every heave of a stone, is performed under the threat of punishment. You feel their eyes on you, even when they're far away. The sound of a whip cracking or a sudden scream becomes a chillingly common occurrence, a stark reminder of the consequences of not working hard enough. A particularly quirky tidbit is the legend, sometimes told in grim whispers among the workers, of overseers who would deliberately bury tools under newly laid sections of the wall if progress was deemed too slow, forcing workers to dig up entire completed sections to retrieve them, simply as a form of arbitrary punishment and to re-emphasize their absolute power. Imagine having to destroy your own work just to retrieve a shovel, knowing it's pure spite. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality of the overseers was primarily a top-down policy mandated by the emperors to ensure rapid construction, or if it was also a product of the dehumanizing nature of forced labor and the stress faced by the overseers themselves, leading to a localized excess of cruelty. Was it imperial design or individual depravity? Disobedience, even a mumbled complaint, could lead to a public flogging. You might be forced to kneel in the dust, stripped to the waist, as the whip lashes across your back, each blow leaving searing welts, designed to inflict pain and humiliate. The goal was to break your spirit, to make you utterly submissive to the imperial will. Your fellow workers would be forced to watch, a silent, terrified audience, as another lesson in obedience was brutally delivered. Attempting to desert was met with even more severe retribution. If caught, a deserter could be mutilated, perhaps losing a hand or a foot, or summarily executed, their body left as a gruesome warning to others contemplating escape. The punishments were deliberately public, designed to instill terror and crush any hope of defiance. The vastness of the empire, and the lack of places to hide, meant that escape was a near impossible dream for most. The supervisors themselves operated under immense pressure from above. Their own lives and careers depended on meeting quotas and ensuring the wall's progress. Failure could lead to their own demotion, torture, or even execution. This created a vicious cycle of cruelty, where fear cascaded down the hierarchy. From the emperor to the lowest conscript, you taste the dust and sweat, and feel the constant strain in your muscles, but more than that, you feel the invisible weight of fear. It dictates your pace, stifles your complaints, and makes you avert your eyes from the casual brutality inflicted upon others. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its colossal scale was achieved not just through brute force and ingenious engineering, but through a chilling system of supervision and brutality, where human lives were utterly expendable, and the iron fist of imperial power crushed any spirit that dared to defy its relentless demand for progress, leaving a legacy of suffering etched into every stone. As you toil under the iron fist of your overseers, amidst the harsh elements and the constant threat of disease, another profound and agonizing reality gnaws at your spirit family separation homes left behind. The forced conscription that brought you to the wall didn't just demand your labor, it ripped you away from everything familiar, severing the deep bonds of family and community, often with little to no hope of return. You carry the emotional burden of absence, the constant ache of longing for loved ones you may never see again, a silent suffering that transcends even the physical brutality. It's like being a single thread pulled from a tightly woven tapestry, leaving a gaping, irreparable hole in its place. You often dream of your village, the familiar faces of your parents, the laughter of your children, the gentle touch of your spouse, but then you wake to the cold, hard reality of the barracks, surrounded by strangers, the sounds of suffering replacing the familiar comforts of home. You've been forcibly marched for weeks or months, leaving behind everyone you ever knew, with no way to communicate, no way to send word, no way to receive comfort. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this profound human cost is that the mass conscription for Great Wall construction often involved tearing men away from their families and communities for extended, indeterminate periods, leading to immense emotional distress, the collapse of family structures, and a sense of abandonment for both the laborers and their loved ones left behind. The wall wasn't just built by forced labor, it was built on broken families. Imagine the last moments you saw them. Your mother's tear-streaked face, your child clinging to your leg, your spouse trying to be brave. Those images haunt your waking hours and fill your fitful sleep. There's no postal service for conscripts, no way to know if they are well, if they are still alive, if they are coping without you. This agonizing uncertainty is a torment that eclipses even the hunger and the physical pain. A particularly quirky tidbit that illustrates the despair of this separation is the folktale of the 10,000 Li Wall of Tears, which claims that the tears of a grieving woman whose husband died building the wall were so powerful they crumbled a section of it, allowing her to find his bones. This legend, a common motif in Chinese folklore, powerfully conveys the profound sorrow and personal sacrifice of families separated by the wall. Imagine a monument literally weeping with the grief of separated families. Historians still argue whether the long-term societal effects of this widespread family separation, such as reduced birth rates, increased poverty in villages, and a breakdown of traditional family support networks, had a greater and more insidious impact on imperial stability than the direct costs of war or natural disaster. Did it just cause personal suffering, or did it weaken the very fabric of Chinese society? The burden on those left behind was immense. Your family, dependent on your labor for their survival, would face increased hardship, poverty, and even starvation without your presence. Your elderly parents might have no one to care for them. Your children might be forced into early labor or in desperate times, even sold into servitude to survive. The ripple effects of your conscription spread far beyond your own suffering, devastating your entire lineage. You hear the quiet sobs of a fellow conscript in the night, murmuring the names of his wife and children. You share a silent understanding, a profound empathy born of shared longing. You might clutch a small, worn token from home, a piece of cloth woven by your mother, a small carved trinket from your child. It's all you have left of them, a tangible link to the world you were brutally torn from. The fear of never returning home, of dying far from your ancestral lands and your family, is a constant, gnawing presence. Many men would simply vanish into the wall's vast, impersonal construction, their names forgotten, their families never knowing their fate, their bones, perhaps mixed with the earth and stone of the monumental barrier they helped to build, forever separated from the soil of their homeland. You trudge along, your body aching, your spirit weary, but the image of your loved ones flickers in your mind, a faint but persistent ember of hope. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its magnificent, enduring structure was built on the foundation of millions of broken families, their bonds severed by imperial decree, their love translated into countless unrecorded acts of quiet, heartbreaking separation, a silent, enduring testament to the human cost of a truly monumental ambition. Even as the brutal construction of the Great Wall pushed relentlessly forward, the imperial authorities faced challenges beyond just logistics and the elements. A persistent and often violent undercurrent of resistance plagued the frontier local resistance hidden dangers. The vast project often encroached on tribal lands, displaced indigenous populations, and drew the ire of bandits and remnants of defeated armies, turning the construction sites into battlegrounds where workers faced not just the whip of the overseer, but the arrows and blades of unseen enemies. You quickly learn that your greatest threat isn't always the visible imperial guard, but the unseen, desperate individuals lurking beyond the wall's burgeoning shadow. It's like trying to build a giant sandcastle, only for angry crabs to constantly try to tear it down. You might be digging a trench or laying stones in a remote, mountainous region, the silence broken only by the clang of tools and the shouts of overseers. Suddenly, an arrow whistles past, or a small band of armed figures emerges from the trees, swift and silent. These are not always the nomadic Xiongnu tribes the wall is meant to keep out. They are often local inhabitants, displaced by the construction, or desperate bandits preying on the vulnerable work camps. One mainstream historical fact that reveals the constant peril faced by workers is that Great Wall construction sites were frequently targeted by raids from indigenous tribes whose lands were encroached upon, as well as by bandits and remnants of rebellious groups, adding an element of direct physical danger and violence to the already brutal conditions faced by the laborers. These were not just construction zones, they were often active conflict zones. Imagine the sudden chaos, the shouts of alarm, the frantic scramble for makeshift weapons, the desperate flight of unarmed laborers caught in the crossfire. You might grab a shovel or a pickaxe, anything to defend yourself, as arrows rain down or swords flash. These attacks are often hit and run, designed to disrupt construction, steal supplies, or simply strike a blow against the imperial presence that is consuming their lands. A particularly quirky tidbit that illustrates the local knowledge and cunning of these resistance groups is their ability to exploit the very terrain the wall builders struggled with. They knew the hidden paths, the secret passes, the treacherous ravines, allowing them to launch surprise attacks and melt away before Imperial reinforcements could arrive. Imagine building a wall to keep enemies out, only to find the enemy knows every secret goat path around it. Historians still argue whether the constant, localized resistance faced by wall builders significantly slowed down the overall pace of construction, or if the imperial state's overwhelming manpower and resources simply absorbed these losses as an acceptable cost of doing business, pressing on regardless of the skirmishes. Did it genuinely hinder construction, or was it just a minor nuisance to the empire? The imperial guards, while brutal to the laborers, were also tasked with defending the sites from these incursions. You might see pitched skirmishes, brief but bloody, as soldiers clash with raiders, protecting the materials and, by extension, the forced labor that was building the wall. Your own survival often depended on the speed and effectiveness of these guards, a chilling irony given their usual role as your tormentors. For the conscripted workers, these raids added another layer of fear to an already terrifying existence. You were not only at the mercy of your overseers and the elements, but also vulnerable to sudden, violent attacks from unseen enemies. The threat of being captured by bandits or killed in a skirmish became another grim possibility in a life already overflowing with perils. Sometimes, the resistance wasn't just violent. It could be subtle, like local populations refusing to provide food or resources, hiding their supplies, or providing misleading information to Imperial scouts. This passive resistance, while less dramatic, could still severely impact the already strained logistics of the wall. You feel the sudden jolt of fear as a distant alarm sounds, or a hushed warning spreads through the work gang. You glance nervously towards the tree line or the mountain pass, knowing that danger could emerge from any direction. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its construction was not just an internal struggle against human endurance and a formidable landscape. It was also a constant battle against hidden dangers and the fierce, often desperate, resistance of those who saw the wall not as a shield, but as a symbol of imperial oppression, turning every stretch of its vast length into a potential battleground. As you continue to toil on the Great Wall, amidst the physical and environmental brutality and the hidden threats of local resistance, you begin to observe a more insidious corruption creeping into the very system that drives the project. Corruption and embezzlement exploiting toil. The immense resources dedicated to building the wall and the desperate circumstances of the conscripted labor created fertile ground for unscrupulous officials to line their own pockets, diverting supplies, skimming funds, and trading in human misery. You quickly learn that even within the emperor's grand vision, petty greed and systemic exploitation were rampant, turning the suffering of millions into personal profit for a select few. It's like watching a massive sacred construction project being secretly siphoned off by a swarm of greedy, invisible leeches. You often go hungry, or shiver in your inadequate clothing, even when you know supplies are supposed to be plentiful. You see convoys of food and materials arriving, but only a fraction of what's needed seems to reach the actual workers. The suspicion begins to grow, a quiet resentment festering among the conscripts. One mainstream historical fact that reveals this dark underbelly is that widespread corruption and embezzlement by officials tasked with managing Great Wall construction projects were common, involving the diversion of food, clothing, tools, and even funds intended for laborers, exacerbating their suffering and increasing mortality rates for the personal gain of corrupt administrators. This systemic exploitation was a major feature of the wall's brutal reality. Imagine the cunning ways these officials could exploit the system. They might falsify records, claiming larger numbers of workers than were actually present, then pocketing the difference in rations, or they might dilute food supplies, selling off the good portions on the black market and providing the laborers with inferior, meager sustenance. Tools. Remember those primitive but vital implements. They might be sold for profit, forcing workers to make do with even less, or purchase their own at exorbitant prices from corrupt vendors linked to the officials. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects this pervasive corruption is the existence of historical complaints from workers or their families about receiving stones that were too small or materials that were clearly substandard. Despite official reports claiming high quality materials were being used, imagine trying to build a massive wall only to find the bricks are half the size they should be, and knowing someone is getting rich off the difference. Historians still argue whether the scale of corruption and embezzlement was a primary reason for the staggeringly high mortality rates on the wall, directly contributing to starvation and disease, or if it was merely an additional layer of suffering on top of already brutal conditions that were largely unavoidable due to logistical challenges and harsh environments. Did it actively kill, or just make dying easier? You witness the comfortable lives of these officials, their better food, their finer clothing, their apparent indifference to the suffering around them. They move with an air of impunity, protected by their rank and the systemic nature of the corruption. To complain to higher authorities was often futile, as the corruption might extend far up the chain of command, and complaining could lead to severe punishment. Remember that iron fist. Even the conscription process itself could be corrupt. Wealthy families might bribe officials to exempt their sons from service, or to send a less valuable individual in their place. This meant that the burden of forced labor disproportionately fell on the poorest and most vulnerable segments of society, those least able to afford bribery or exert influence. The sheer scale of the wall project, spread over thousands of miles and across centuries, made effective oversight incredibly difficult. Local officials, operating far from the imperial court, often had free rein to exploit the system, knowing that accountability was rare and distant. The suffering of the conscripts was simply a byproduct of their personal enrichment. You feel the deep sense of injustice, the burning resentment that simmers beneath the surface of the work camps. You toil endlessly, risking your life for a grand imperial project, while others grow fat and wealthy from your misery. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its magnificent structure, a symbol of national defense, was simultaneously a monument to systemic corruption and the ruthless exploitation of human toil. Every stone laid, every ounce of sweat shed, was not just for the emperor, but for the unseen pockets of greedy officials, turning an act of forced labor into a chilling act of grand-scale embezzlement. As you continue your grueling labor on the Great Wall, battling the elements and the rampant corruption, you quickly encounter yet another formidable challenge: material scarcity. Resourceful desperation. Building a structure thousands of miles long required unimaginable quantities of stone, earth, wood, and brick. But often, the desired materials were not readily available in the remote, harsh frontier regions where the wall was being built, forcing workers and overseers alike into desperate, ingenious, and often environmentally destructive methods to source and transport what they needed. It's like trying to bake a massive cake, but realizing halfway through you're missing half your ingredients and have to forage for substitutes in a barren wasteland. You might be assigned to a section where there are no nearby quarries, or where forests are sparse. The imperial decree demands stone, but the nearest suitable rock formation is miles away, across treacherous terrain. This forces work gangs into arduous, time-consuming expeditions just to find and extract raw materials. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this challenge is that the vast length and varied terrain of the Great Wall necessitated the use of diverse and often locally scarce building materials, forcing laborers to find, quarry, and transport immense quantities of stone, earth, timber, and later brick, often over long distances using rudimentary methods and incredible effort. This constant search for materials added significantly to the labor's difficulty and danger. Imagine the backbreaking work of quarrying stone by hand, using chisels, hammers, and wedges to split rock from cliffs or riverbeds. Then, each massive block has to be dressed roughly shaped and somehow moved to the construction site. For timber, you might be sent into distant forests, felling trees with simple axes, and then dragging the heavy logs back. sometimes for days or weeks. A particularly quirky tidbit that showcases this desperation for materials is the use of rammed earth hang-to for large sections of the wall, especially in the plains and desert regions where stone was scarce. This involved compacting layers of earth, gravel, and sometimes even reeds or straw into wooden frames, creating incredibly dense and durable walls. Imagine building a massive fortification out of what looks like glorified dirt, relying on sheer human force to make it strong. Historians still argue whether the strategic choice to use locally abundant materials like rammed earth in certain sections of the wall was primarily an ingenious adaptation to resource scarcity and terrain, demonstrating practical engineering wisdom, or if it was also a concession to the immense logistical difficulties of transporting heavier, more durable materials across such vast and challenging distances. Was it clever design or simple necessity? Transporting these materials, once sourced, was a monumental task in itself. We talked about the logistics nightmare earlier, and material transport was a huge part of it. Human porters carried heavy loads on their backs, sometimes up steep mountain paths. Animal-drawn carts, often overloaded, struggled over rough terrain. In some desperate cases, materials might even be rolled or slid down inclines using crude sleds, often with high risk to the workers guiding them. The constant demand for materials meant that forests were denuded, and local rock formations were relentlessly chipped away, leaving scars on the landscape that endure to this day. The scarcity also led to resourcefulness. In areas with abundant clay, bricks were made on site in makeshift kilns, a laborious process of digging clay, molding bricks, firing them, and then transporting them to the exact point of construction. This added another layer of skilled, yet still brutal, labor to the project. You feel the sharp pain in your shoulders from carrying heavy timbers, the grit of earth in your mouth as you pound rammed earth, and the constant strain of trying to find suitable stone in a barren landscape. Your survival depends not just on your strength, but on the ability of your overseers to find and deliver materials. A constant, knife-edge balance. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its vast, imposing presence was achieved not through endless abundance, but through a constant, desperate struggle against material scarcity, forcing countless workers to literally scour the earth, leaving no stone unturned in their relentless, often futile, search for the next building block of imperial ambition. As you continue your grueling, desperate labor on the Great Wall, battling starvation, disease, and the iron fist of your overseers, a chilling, persistent legend circulates among the work gangs, a whisper of the ultimate brutal truth. Wall of Bones human sacrifice? This isn't just a grim metaphor for the countless lives lost. It's a terrifying folk belief, deeply rooted in the historical reality of immense mortality rates, that claims the bodies of deceased laborers were sometimes incorporated directly into the wall's foundations, becoming unwilling sacrifices to its immense scale and durability. You trudge past newly laid sections, a cold shiver running down your spine, wondering if the very mortar beneath your feet contains the dust of fallen comrades. It's like discovering that the foundations of a grand, ancient monument are literally built upon a hidden cemetery. You might hear the story from an older, more cynical conscript, his voice low and grim, recounting tales passed down through generations of forced laborers. The sheer number of deaths, from exhaustion, disease, accidents, or punishment, was so staggering that disposal of the bodies became an overwhelming logistical challenge, leading to desperate and often undignified measures. One mainstream historical fact that fuels this grim legend is that, while there is no definitive archaeological evidence proving widespread intentional human sacrifice by burying bodies within the Great Wall's foundations, the immense death toll from construction meant that countless workers perished and were buried in or near the wall, leading to the widespread folk belief and popular designation of the wall as the longest cemetery in the world. The sheer proximity of death to construction was undeniable. Imagine a man collapsing from exhaustion, never to rise. or a worker struck down by a falling stone. Instead of a proper burial, which would take time and effort away from the wall's relentless progress, their bodies might be hastily interred in shallow graves directly beneath new sections, or even in the grimmest tellings, simply covered over with earth and stone. The idea was to save time and effort, and perhaps for some superstitious officials, to imbue the wall with a spiritual foundation, a morbid form of human sacrifice to ensure its strength. A particularly quirky tidbit related to this legend is the tale of the Crying Wall. This variation of the Mengjiangnu legend, remember her tears. From Section 1, the Weeping Walls often features her tears causing a section of the wall to collapse, not just from grief, but because her husband's body was incorporated into it, and her sorrow revealed his misplaced remains. Imagine a physical manifestation of human suffering being so profound it causes literal collapse in the very structure built upon it. Historians still argue whether the persistent Wall of Bones legend was primarily a powerful allegorical expression of the immense human suffering and high mortality rates during construction, serving as a form of cultural memory and protest, or if it has some basis in desperate ad hoc burial practices where bodies were indeed sometimes incorporated into the immediate vicinity of the wall's foundations for convenience. Was it purely metaphor, or a grim reality of expediency? The sheer despair of the workers would have lent credence to such grim tales. If your life was already considered expendable, a mere tool for imperial ambition, then your body, even in death, could be just another building material. The fear of ending up as an anonymous part of the wall, far from your family and ancestral lands, was a powerful, unspoken terror that fueled the legend. You hear the quiet whispers in the barracks at night? The morbid speculation among the conscripts about who might be next, whose bones might contribute to the next watchtower or section of rampart. The lack of formal, respectful burials for so many would have reinforced this gruesome belief. Bodies were often simply disposed of, not honored, by the imperial system. The image of the Wall of Bones, whether literal or symbolic, serves as the most potent reminder of the human cost of this monumental achievement. It strips away any romanticism, any sense of glory, and lays bare the brutal reality of forced labor on an unimaginable scale. You feel the cold dread of knowing that the very ground you stand on, the very stones you heft, might contain the remnants of countless lives consumed by this imperial ambition. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its magnificent, enduring structure, a testament to human will and engineering, also stands as a chilling, colossal tomb, a wall of bones, whispering grim tales of human sacrifice and suffering across the vast, silent centuries. Even if you somehow survived the relentless labor, the harsh climate, the invisible diseases, the iron fist of the overseers, and the chilling prospect of becoming part of the Wall of Bones, your work on the Great Wall was never truly done. This monumental structure demanded perpetual attention, leading to the reality of constant repair, never-ending work. The forces of nature, human conflict, and the sheer scale of the construction meant that even as sections were being built, others were already crumbling, requiring endless cycles of maintenance, renovation, and reconstruction, turning the wall into a perpetually unfinished symphony of toil. It's like trying to fill a bottomless pit with sand, knowing that as fast as you pour it in, it's slipping away somewhere else. You might have just finished a section, feeling a brief, fleeting sense of accomplishment, only to be immediately reassigned to another area, perhaps miles away, where an older section of the wall is already in disrepair. The very elements that made building so brutal, the wind, the rain, the extreme temperatures, also relentlessly attack the finished structure, causing erosion, cracking mortar, and weakening foundations. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this continuous challenge is that the Great Wall, due to its immense length, varied construction materials, and exposure to harsh environmental conditions, required constant and ongoing repair, maintenance, and reconstruction throughout its centuries-long history. turning its upkeep into a never-ending cycle of labor for successive dynasties. The building of the wall was, in reality, a perpetual process of rebuilding and mending. Imagine a section built centuries ago, made of rammed earth. Over time, heavy rains erode its outer layers, winds pick away at its surface, and frost causes cracks to form. Now, you're sent to repair it, digging out crumbling sections, hauling new earth, and compacting it all over again, often with the same primitive tools and under the same brutal conditions. It's a Sisyphean task where the mountain of work never truly diminishes. A particularly quirky tidbit that emphasizes this continuous effort is the existence of numerous repair records and imperial edicts throughout various dynasties, detailing specific sections of the wall that needed urgent attention due to collapse or deterioration. Imagine an ancient bureaucracy dedicated entirely to tracking sections of a colossal wall falling apart, issuing orders for new conscripts to go fix it. Historians still argue whether the astronomical cost in human lives and resources for constant wall repair was ultimately a worthwhile defensive investment for the Chinese empires, or if the sheer maintenance burden became a significant drain on the imperial treasury and manpower, arguably outweighing its practical defensive benefits in the long term. Was it a necessary shield or a perpetual drain? Human activity also contributed to the need for constant repair. Local villagers, desperate for building materials, might subtly or not so subtly chip away at sections of the wall, taking stones or bricks for their own homes. Bandits or rebellious groups might deliberately damage sections to create breaches or to spite imperial authority. Even passing armies on whether friend or foe could cause wear and tear. The wall was also a living, evolving entity, constantly being adapted and extended. New dynasties might add their own sections, rebuild older parts to new specifications like the Ming Dynasty's extensive use of brick, or construct new watchtowers and fortresses to adapt to changing military threats. So, even if a section you worked on stood firm, the overall project of the Great Wall was still expanding, still demanding more labor, more resources. You feel the familiar ache in your back, the dust in your lungs, as you work on a section that was built by generations before you, knowing that generations after you might be repairing the very same stones. The knowledge that your arduous labor is part of a never-ending cycle, a continuous struggle against time and nature, adds a layer of quiet despair to your already brutal existence. The wall, in its monumental glory, stands as a testament to this constant repair. The distinct styles of different dynasties, the varying materials, the patchwork appearance of many sections, all tell a silent story of ceaseless effort. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its magnificent, enduring presence was not a one-time achievement, but the result of an unbroken chain of human suffering and relentless labor. It was a never-ending task, requiring countless lives to be sacrificed, not just for its initial construction, but for its perpetual existence. A monument built and rebuilt over and over again, brick by brutal brick, through the vast, unforgiving sweep of Chinese history. After enduring the unimaginable brutality of forced labor, the ravages of climate and disease, the relentless demands of logistics and ruthless overseers, and the never-ending cycle of repair, you finally step back to contemplate the ultimate meaning of this colossal undertaking legacy, enduring monument, human cost. The Great Wall of China stands today as one of the most awe-inspiring architectural achievements in human history, a symbol of imperial power and strategic defense. But for those who built it, its grandeur is forever inseparable from the staggering, unrecorded human suffering that brought it into existence. It's like looking at a magnificent, towering skyscraper, but knowing that every rivet and beam was fastened with the literal blood and tears of countless unseen workers. You gaze at a section of the wall, perhaps a beautifully preserved stretch of brick and stone, winding majestically over rolling hills. From a distance, it looks like a dragon, a timeless symbol of power and protection. This is the image that history often celebrates. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this dual legacy is that while the Great Wall of China stands as a global symbol of ancient Chinese engineering prowess, imperial power, and defensive strategy, its construction came at an immense and brutal human cost, with millions of conscripted laborers suffering death, displacement, and extreme hardship, making it a monument to both ingenuity and human suffering. Its iconic status often overshadows its grim origins. Imagine the tourists who walk these very ramparts today, marveling at its scale, unaware of the individual agonies that each stone represents. They might take photos, share stories of its grandeur, and feel a sense of awe. But for you, who lived through its construction, the wall is a testament to the endless suffering of your comrades. A vast, silent graveyard stretching across the landscape. A particularly quirky tidbit that encapsulates this grim human cost is the popular, though historically unsubstantiated, nickname for the wall, the longest cemetery in the world. While no evidence supports widespread intentional burials within the wall, the sheer number of deaths from accidents, disease, and exhaustion meant that countless bodies were interred in shallow graves or mass pits directly alongside its construction. Imagine a monument so massive that its very foundation is rumored to be built on the bones of its creators. Historians still argue whether the extreme emphasis on the human suffering and mortality associated with the wall's construction is an oversimplification that risks overshadowing the genuine strategic achievements and the complex geopolitical reasons for its existence. Or if it is a necessary counterbalance to the often romanticized view of the wall, providing a more balanced and humane historical perspective. Is it too grim, or precisely grim enough? The strategic effectiveness of the wall is also part of its complex legacy. Did it truly stop the nomadic incursions it was designed to repel? In many instances, no. Invaders often found ways around it, or simply bribed their way through its gates. Yet it did serve as a psychological barrier, a deterrent, and a logistical platform for defense, allowing for quicker troop movements and communication. Its failure was rarely total, its success rarely absolute. The wall stands as a powerful symbol of centralized imperial power. Its very existence demonstrates the immense capacity of ancient Chinese dynasties to mobilize vast resources and human labor for a single, colossal objective. It showcases remarkable engineering ingenuity, particularly in its adaptation to varied terrain and its use of diverse materials. But this ingenuity was often born of desperation, and the power was wielded with terrifying ruthlessness. For the modern world, the Great Wall serves as a tangible reminder of the complex relationship between monumental human achievement and the profound ethical costs that can accompany it. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ambition, power, and the value of individual lives in the face of grand state projects. You stand there now, a survivor, gazing at the wall. It is beautiful in its scale, awe-inspiring in its defiance of nature. But for you, it is also a silent scream, a testament to the millions who toiled and died, their lives sacrificed for a vision that transcended their own existence. The awful truth about building the Great Wall of China is that its enduring monument, a wonder of the world, is inextricably linked to the unseen, unwritten legacy of its brutal human cost. Every brick whispers a story of suffering, a quiet, heartbreaking counterpoint to its celebrated grandeur, ensuring that its awful truth resonates through the silent centuries. Now, as the long, winding shadow of the Great Wall fades into the distance, and the sounds of ancient toil grow quiet, let your mind settle into the peaceful calm of your room. The brutal realities of forced labor, the harsh climate, and the unseen killers are safely in the past. Part of a history that now dissolves into the gentle hum of your fan? You've journeyed through a monumental yet tragic piece of the past, and now it's time for you to find your own peace. Let your mind unwind, Your muscles relax and sink into a deep, undisturbed sleep, far from the echoes of the wall of bones. End of script. Sweet dreams.